let's talk about something that's had a massive impact on the world: Marxist-Leninist theory. Now, before you imagine a dusty old textbook, think of this as a conversation, a guided tour through a set of ideas that are often misunderstood. We're not here to judge them or debate them, but to simply understand where they came from, what they mean, and how they played out in history. So where do we begin? Well, the name itself gives us the first clue. It's a blend of ideas from two key figures, Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin. To really get it, we have to look at each of them individually first. Part 1. The Foundations with Karl Marx. Imagine you're living in the mid-19th century, during the height of the Industrial Revolution. Factories are booming, wealth is being created on an unimaginable scale, but the people who are actually doing the work, the laborers, are often living in terrible conditions. Long hours, low wages, and dangerous workplaces are the norm. This is the world Karl Marx was observing. He was an economist, a historian, and a philosopher, and he wasn't happy with what he saw. Marx's big idea was something called historical materialism. This is a fancy term for a simple concept. He believed that history isn't driven by the actions of great kings or religious ideas, but by the material conditions of society. What he meant was, the way people produce things, the economy, shapes everything else: the politics, the culture, the laws, and the social classes. He argued that throughout history, there's always been a conflict between social classes, a constant struggle. This brings us to his most famous concept, class struggle. Marx saw society as divided into two main groups, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The bourgeoisie were the capitalists, the owners of the factories, the land, and the means of production. The proletariat were the workers, who owned nothing but their ability to work. Marx believed the bourgeoisie exploited the proletariat by paying them less than the value of the goods they produced. The difference between the worker's wage and the total value they created was what Marx called surplus value, and he saw it as the source of the capitalist's profit. He also talked about alienation. Think about a worker on an assembly line. They might spend all day tightening a single bolt. They don't see the final product, they don't control their own work, and they don't even get to keep the full value of their labor. Marx argued this process makes the worker feel disconnected or alienated from their work, from the product of their labor, and even from other people. Marx believed that this class struggle was an inevitable path toward a final decisive revolution. The proletariat, growing in number and getting more and more organized, would eventually rise up, overthrow the bourgeoisie, and seize the means of production for themselves. This would lead to a society without private property, class, or a state, a communist society. He saw this not as an idealistic dream, but as a scientific inevitability, the logical conclusion of history. Part 2. The Revolutionary with Vladimir Lenin. Fast forward a few decades to the early 20th century in Russia. The country is still ruled by a czar, the economy is backward, and the working class is small but growing and increasingly restless. This is where Vladimir Lenin comes in. He was a committed Marxist, but he faced a problem. Marx's theory suggested that a communist revolution would happen in an advanced capitalist country, like Germany or England. Russia was not that, so Lenin made some crucial additions to Marx's theory. His most significant contribution was the concept of the vanguard party. Lenin didn't think the working class would spontaneously organize and overthrow the state on their own. He argued they needed a guiding force, a disciplined professional group of revolutionaries who would lead them. This vanguard party would be made up of the most class-conscious and dedicated members of the proletariat, acting as the brain and nerve center of the revolution. Another key idea from Lenin was his theory of imperialism. He argued that capitalism, in its final stage, becomes global and relies on a few powerful nations, the imperialists, to exploit weaker, less developed nations for their resources and cheap labor. This, he said, was a way for capitalist nations to temporarily avoid revolution at home, as they could use the super profits from their colonies to placate their own working class with slightly better wages and conditions. Lenin believed this made a revolution in a less developed, weak-link country like Russia possible. Finally, Lenin introduced the concept of democratic centralism. Once the vanguard party seized power, it would be organized according to this principle. It meant that a decision, once made by the central leadership, was binding on all members, even those who had initially opposed it. This was all about ensuring unity and a unified direction for the party and the state. Part 3. The synthesis, Marxism-Leninism. Now let's put these two ideas together. Marxist-Leninist theory is the combination of Marx's economic and historical analysis with Lenin's practical political strategy for seizing and maintaining power. It's a roadmap from capitalism to communism, adapted for a pre-industrial setting. The core tenets of this combined theory are historical materialism, the belief that economic forces are the primary driver of historical change; class struggle, the fundamental conflict between the capitalist owners and the working class; the vanguard party, the necessity of a disciplined professional party to lead the revolution and guide the working class; the dictatorship of the proletariat, a transitional phase after the revolution where the state is controlled by the working class to suppress the remnants of the bourgeoisie and prevent counter-revolution. Lenin saw this as a necessary but temporary state. Internationalism, the idea that the revolution is not just for one country but should spread globally. So in a nutshell, Marx provided the why, the analysis of why capitalism was inherently unstable and what the future would be. Lenin provided the how, the practical strategy for how to actually make that revolution happen, especially in a place that didn't fit Marx's original model. Part 4. Theory in practice. The Soviet experiment. The most famous and arguably most significant application of Marxist-Leninist theory was the 1917 Russian Revolution, led by Lenin's Bolshevik Party. They successfully overthrew the provisional government and established the world's first socialist state, which would later become the Soviet Union. Initially, the Bolsheviks faced immense challenges: civil war, foreign intervention, and a broken economy. The dictatorship of the proletariat quickly became a reality, as the state was used to eliminate opposition, collectivize agriculture, and centralize the economy. Under Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, the theory was further modified into what's sometimes called Stalinism. Stalin pushed for socialism in one country instead of global revolution, focusing on rapid industrialization and agricultural collectivization within the Soviet Union. This period was marked by immense state control, political purges, and severe repression. While followers of the theory would argue that these actions were necessary to protect the revolution, critics point to them as a fundamental betrayal of Marxist ideals. After World War II, Marxist-Leninist theory was exported to other countries, particularly in Eastern Europe, China, and parts of Asia and Africa. Each of these states adapted the theory to its own unique circumstances, but the core principles of a one-party state, state ownership of the means of production, and a centrally planned economy remained. Part 5. The legacy and debates. The legacy of Marxist-Leninist theory is deeply complex and highly debated. On one hand, its proponents argue that it provided a powerful framework for understanding and resisting capitalist exploitation and imperialism. They point to the Soviet Union's role in defeating fascism in World War II, and to the massive gains in literacy, healthcare, and industrialization achieved in many of the states that adopted the theory. For millions of people, it offered a vision of a more just and equal society. On the other hand, its critics point to the massive human toll and economic failures of states that implemented it. They argue that the dictatorship of the proletariat almost always led to the dictatorship of a single party, and often a single leader. The suppression of dissent, lack of political freedom, and often disastrous economic planning are cited as reasons why the theory, in practice, failed to deliver on its promises of a more liberated society. They argue that the theory itself, with its emphasis on a vanguard party and central control, contains the seeds of authoritarianism. The power of the state, intended to wither away after the revolution, only grew stronger, leading to a new form of class-like hierarchy, with the party elite holding immense power and privilege. A final word. So there you have it, a brief conversational overview of Marxist-Leninist theory. It's a system of thought that combines Marx's grand analysis of history and economics with Lenin's concrete plan for revolution and state building. It's not just a collection of old ideas, it's a theory that, for better or worse, shaped the entire 20th century and continues to be debated and discussed today. Whether you see it as a blueprint for liberation or a recipe for disaster, understanding it is key to understanding modern history.